Good morning, everyone, and greetings from Narok in Kenya. First of all, I would like to really appreciate the organizers of this very important meeting on justice for peace through traditional knowledge systems and conservation, recognition, revitalizing, and reconciliation. The University of Rwanda Center for Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management at the University of Sheffield, Sheffield Institute for International Development, and all of you together, thank you for really organizing this very, very critical event. Given the importance of traditional knowledge in the modern world, especially in the environment and conservation debates generally, and in the context of climate change, among others. I think this is a very, very beautiful opportunity, which I hope that this discussion is not just the beginning and the end of this discussion, but this is something that will be ongoing. Secondly, thank you also for honoring me with such a big opportunity of welcoming me to participate as a keynote speaker in this important event. Unfortunately, due to other engagements, I could not be able to personally come to Rwanda for this workshop. But I'm glad that since we are all technologically connected nowadays, then we are far, but we are still together. But thankfully, my wife Naomi Lanoi was able to attend, and since she's there, then indirectly I'm also present in your midst. Thank you so much for inviting both myself and my wife. So I think the whole idea of traditional knowledge is actually gaining global interests over the last few years, especially in the climate change arena, biodiversity conservation, and in the intellectual property rights regime, in the intellectual property rights space. And I've seen that from the objectives of the meeting, part of what you're asking is to share good experiences, increase understanding of existing programs and initiatives, identify best practices around the protection and transfer of traditional knowledge, including research, conservation, and for commercial purposes, informing and encouraging reconciliation, strengthening networks of individuals, which is a very, very important thing, and then learning from lessons and initiatives in other countries through the participation of external experts, which is non-Rwandans like me and others who are from outside outside Rwanda. So I think we should actually start by trying to briefly understand what we mean by traditional knowledge. And in a layman's language, I'll just say that when creation happened, the land and flora and fauna in it were created. And when humanity, the presence of humanity materialized on this space, the human started interacting with that environment and consequently learned how to live with the environment, to manage it, so that it could provide essential elements like food, water, spiritual nourishment, cultural spaces, even commerce, livelihoods, among other things. So that knowledge that has been developed out over centuries is what we actually called what is actually becomes traditional knowledge. And as UNESCO defines it, UNESCO calls it the understandings, skills, and philosophies developed by societies with long histories of interaction with their natural surroundings. So, for rural and indigenous communities, traditional knowledge informs decision-making about the fundamental aspects of their day-to-day living. So, when we look at this broad definition of traditional knowledge, we see one very basic element that must actually be there for traditional knowledge to thrive, and that is the aspect of land rights. So, because as we have seen, it's the understandings and skills and philosophies developed by societies through interactions with specific environments over a long period of time. So, when communities are removed from their land, when communities are no longer able to own and control their lands, when communities are no longer able to govern their lands, then it becomes very, very difficult to continue practicing traditional knowledge. The other characteristic about traditional knowledge is that it is gendered. When you look at African communities, there are gendered roles for both men and women. Men do different things, like for example, in the Maasai community, it's the men who look after the livestock, provide security for the home, among others, while the women build the homes, milk the cows, and do many other things, among others. When you look at hunter-gatherer communities, it's the men who go hunting for wild meat for protein, and it's the women actually who go gathering wild fruits and roots to act as carbohydrates and all the other things that are needed by the body to ensure that there's enough nutrition for the family. So traditional knowledge is gendered. Women have specific knowledge about environment and the environments in which they live in. Men also have specific knowledge about the environment that they live in. Traditional knowledge is also intergenerational in the sense that it's transferred from one generation to another. So, and this is done normally through interactions by children with their parents and of course the entire society, because as you know, in African societies, life is not about individualism, but it's more about communal living. So within that communal space, there's a lot of intergenerational sharing of knowledge. And knowledge, also in traditional knowledge, specific knowledge is not owned by an individual. So even if in a community, say like the Maasai or the Ogiek or the Hadzabe or the Twa or of the San Bushmen or whatever, even if, for example, there's a medicine man in that community who has a lot of knowledge about specific plants that cure certain diseases, that knowledge does not become his knowledge. It's communal in nature. It's held by the entire community. So, and that is a very, very big difference between traditional knowledge and the formal intellectual property rights regime, where knowledge is more of sort of individualized. But then we also see that traditional knowledge is also shared across communities. So you'll find that one knowledge might be available in the Maasai and the same knowledge is available among the Ogiek, which are their neighboring communities. Or you'll find that the same knowledge that is practiced by the Maasai in Kenya might be practiced by the Barbaig in Tanzania or even the Mbororo in Cameroon, but using different terminologies. So those are some of the characteristics of traditional knowledge. I'm sure all of you know all these things. So, and this, I'm just talking about this to serve as a background to actually now start addressing the specific questions that have been asked in the context of the workshop objectives. And having said that, then we look at some of the challenges then that comes with the protection of traditional knowledge. And as I've said, this knowledge is collectively owned. So who will protect it? Number two, it's shared among communities. It spreads across communities. So how can which community can claim rights over specific knowledge? And the number three is that we are changing, the society that we are living in, we are changing drastically, and I'm glad that this has been recognized by the workshop organizers. So we are really changing. We are getting educated at a very, very high rate. And in most cases, the kind of education we get, even that related to conservation, is always Western oriented. It comes from the West, and then we learn techniques of conservation instead of learning, actually learning from what our ancestors have been doing. And of course, also, one of the other things that is really driving change drastically is the whole idea of religion. I think in Africa, we have taken religion, we have stretched it so far that we think that anything that is associated with an African, anything that is associated with your culture is satanic. And in most cases, when you go to African villages, you'll find a lot of priests preaching that message and trying to actually westernize themselves a lot because of their Christian background. I can give you an example. One example I can give is in a meeting in a county in Kenya called Kajiado. A lady stands to introduce herself, and she's a local lady. Everybody knows her as a member of a certain family, and she introduces herself as Mary Johnson. And then people are like, why don't you introduce your family? She says, no, when I use my Maasai name, it's satanic, So that is really, so religion is actually speedily encouraging people to discard their traditional knowledge because they associate the ritual, they associate anything that is not traditional to the devil. So that becomes one of the major challenges that we have. And then obviously the next challenge is recognition of traditional knowledge is actually almost zero in many African countries. Right now, very, very few African countries have a law on traditional knowledge. I think Kenya developed one in 2016. South Africa also has one. I think Zambia has some, but subject to confirmation. Even though at the international level, African governments commit to conventions and protocols and targets that speak about traditional knowledge. For example, African governments have established the African Regional Intellectual Property Organization, ARIPO, which the mandate of ARIPO under the Swapcomund protocol is to look at traditional knowledge. So at that level, African governments agree that traditional knowledge is really quite important. But when they go back to their countries, they don't give it the necessary political will, the necessary attention that traditional knowledge deserves. Another example I can give is that when you go to the climate change negotiations, after the Paris Agreement in 2015, that agreement featured the need to recognize indigenous and local communities' rights, and of course, for these communities, the knowledge systems of these communities to contribute into the climate change dialogues. So these communities then, so within that UNFCCC framework, a local communities and indigenous peoples platform was created. And ideally, the purpose of this platform is to start gathering information on how communities worldwide are utilizing traditional knowledge to mitigate or adapt to climate change. And then when you look at that Paris Agreement too, countries give what they call nationally determined contributions, which they have to review every 5 years. So the African Development Bank has developed a hub for nationally determined contributions for all the African countries. So we did a basic research on all the 54 African countries that have already sent their nationally determined contributions to the world, to the UNFCCC, to see how many had featured traditional knowledge. I think it's only 3 which had actually just mentioned it in passing. So when you look at the Aichi Target 11, African countries have committed to it, but at the ground they're not implementing it. The post-2020 post-2020 biodiversity agenda, also African governments are participating strongly, but on the ground they are not. The World Heritage Convention too requires now, after we push for the change successfully of the operational guidelines of the World Heritage Convention, now African governments, and not African governments, but governments are actually now legally bound to include traditional knowledge in designing World Heritage sites for inscription. But of course, this is not materializing at the local level. So you see, there's a big challenge there in terms of recognition, respect at the national level. And now talking about recognition and respect, as is part of the workshop. So I think we need to look at recognition and respect in the context of governments, 1. Number 2, the conservation agenda, the conservation players. Number 3, we also look at the recognition and respect by communities themselves. So I think this is a very important topic. How will governments recognize and respect? I think that will be through laws and policies. Governments should enact laws and policies, but not just enacting, but actually going that step further and implementing them. Kenya enacted a traditional knowledge law in 2016, and that law requires each community to document their traditional knowledge, and then the local, which we call here county government, creates a repository of that knowledge, and that repository is actually shared at the national level, so that whenever an interested person or an interested community goes either to the national level or to the county level and asks about a specific knowledge, they are told, go directly to this community because already a repository has been established. The good thing is about what that law says is that the knowledge still belongs to the communities, even though it's the government which will be holding the repository. But since the act was enacted in 2016, not a single county has actually gone that step, or not a single community has actually gone that step to try and establish a repository. So recognition and respect should not just end there in laws and policies, but actually it should go to that extent of practice, actually implementing those laws and policies. So talking about some of the things that have been mentioned in the objective in regards to recognition and protection specifically. Let me just open that message quickly, and then I can contribute directly to that. So in terms of communities themselves recognizing their knowledge and respecting it too, I want to argue that as we increasingly westernize, as we increasingly become educated and change our religions, we no longer also tend to respect our traditional knowledge systems. And even the people who are pushing for the recognition and respect of traditional knowledge are not themselves practitioners. So we talk about it in hotel rooms, but we do very little actually to go down to the communities and tell them, hey, what you are doing, what you have been doing historically, you should actually recognize and respect it, because it's quite important. Like, for example, if I may ask, in this room, how many people are actually practitioners of traditional knowledge, other than through what they read or in their academic pursuits? Okay? So the other thing that is being asked here is, how is traditional knowledge being recognized? Okay? So I said already, through laws and policies. But then through the IPBES, there's at the UN level, there is an effort to try and connect traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge. So that discussion is ongoing, and I participate in it sometimes. But I think it's a good effort, because now we live increasingly in a globalized world. There should be traditional knowledge should inform scientific knowledge and vice versa. So one example I can give in that is in Western Kenya, there's a group of rainmakers who are they use traditional methods, and they have been doing that for centuries, and they predict the rainfall. So now they have entered into a partnership with the Kenyan Meteorological Department, and together they predict rainfall in that western part of Kenya, and they have been facilitated to do a radio station that now they announce the weather patterns and prepare because they are a farm, that community is a farming community. They prepare the community on when to plant and etc. So the other thing is I've participated a lot in biocultural protocols, and I'm sorry to say this, but sometimes I feel that though the Nagoya protocols, though the biocultural protocols are an integral part of the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity, it has tended to be mostly an NGO thing. I've seen a lot of NGOs. I've also been part of those NGOs who actually say we are writing biocultural protocols for communities, but we don't tend to, actually when the document is written, there is no ownership of the community now to start practicing and actualizing it. So I think there should be a discussion on how to actualize those biocultural protocols to make them actually do the purpose that they were meant to do, though they are a very good thing. Inclusive conservation, what does it mean? Bring everybody into that conservation agenda. Indigenous people, local communities, conservation, governments, and etc. Let's all work together to see what works best for all of us. The problem has been that for long, the government has only been pursuing fortress conservation, where they say, push everybody out, and then you put the police to guard the farm, to guard the forest or the park, and they exclude everybody. We have those examples in Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, everywhere. Well, like when you go to the volcanoes, you'll find that there are no, to the volcanoes were the traditional territories of the Twa. But now I don't think the Twa are living inside those parks because of fortress conservation. So how do we address that? And the Twa will not be able to address, to practice their traditional knowledge if they are not actually living within those environments that they used to live in. So restoration, revitalization is a very, very critical element because we are losing it. When you go to a community like the Yaku in Kenya, there are only 4 people alive who can still speak that language. So a lot of it is getting lost. So how do we revitalize it? So one of the things is recognition of the traditional knowledge holders. We know there are elders. We know there are within our communities, there are people who have certain skills based on traditional knowledge. For example, midwives, they have been doing this. So why don't we certify these midwives and give them certificates of practice and say, well, you've been practicing midwifery for a number of years, here is your certificate, recognize it formally. In fact, in Kenya, the president recently ordered, during the Madaraka Day celebrations, June 1st in Kisumu, the president ordered that the Juakali workers, they have not gone to school, but they can create almost anything, desks, chairs, desks, beds, everything. So he ordered the Ministry of Education to look for a way to satisfy that, to certify that knowledge that these people hold. So why can't we extend that kind to traditional knowledge holders? An example I'll give you is in IPAC, the Indigenous People of Africa Coordinating Committee, the network that I'm currently the director, we did in 2008, 2007, we did kind of a certification program to recognize sun trackers. Because the idea here was that the sun have been tracking animals for quite a long time, and they can recognize the spoors, which animal steps here, when, is it injured, is it well, was it running, okay? So this knowledge, if it can be certified and recognized formally, and then this guy can be given a job, you see, this is a way to revitalize that traditional knowledge, to connect it with economic and livelihood, to establish a livelihood connection. So, and this tracking, we brought it together with a technology called Cyber Tracker, okay, and a certification program of Sun Tracker started. That is something that can happen in other areas of traditional knowledge. For example, the medicine that we have, the fruits, perfumery, many things, because our traditional knowledge revolves around everything that is also, that we can also get from shops. And then this recognition and revitalization should be gendered, and I support that, especially since, as I said earlier, traditional knowledge has both aspects of gender. There's that knowledge that is held by men, and there's that knowledge that is held by women. But of course, we must also start being comfortable as the educated African to practice traditional knowledge. I see increasingly when it comes to food and nutrition, many of us are going back to traditional vegetables, the vegetables that we used to eat, the muteres, the managus, the whatever. If you know all those things, we are going back to them. So how can we go back also to traditional medicine? And I'm happy that in the Maasai and Ogiek and other communities, I see a lot of very educated people going back to those traditional medicine. So how can we use the livelihood aspect to start a process of revitalizing that traditional knowledge? So, and I think the whole aspect of reconciliation is very key, in the sense that I know in the context of Rwanda, talking about tribes and traditional knowledge, which tribe holds what, again as the background of what happened in the early 90s, might still be a bit of a challenge. But I think it's important that this discussion is put on the table because we should recognize unity, but in diversity, as we are trying to do in Kenya and in other parts of Africa. And I think traditional knowledge can be a very, very important component of building that reconciliation and decolonizing the mind. Decolonizing the mind means that we should not be following everything that we get from the Western world, and now increasingly China. So we have to also start seeing that what we own, our belief system, the way we led our life, the food system we had, constitutes a very, very significant part of our existence. And this can also be recognized by the other parts of the world whom we are always following. When you look at the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of discovery was about controlling your mind, controlling your identity, controlling your thought process. And I know that for other parts in the US, Canada, wherever, where this doctrine of discovery has been in existence for over 500 years, in Africa it's about the first colonialists when they started actually now colonizing us properly after the Berlin Conference. So we still have that connection between our cultures, and a bit we are still going towards the Western way, which makes us lost in between. But I think we should actually now not go that much. But to conclude, I think there's a video that has been circulating on WhatsApp of a student from the Gambia who was offered scholarships, I think in Canada and the United Kingdom, to go and study some subject I've forgotten, I'll remember that. And he chose not to go. He chose not to go to those countries because he said they are too far away, their knowledge system is different from ours. What I'll go and learn there will get lost there, so it will not be actually of benefit to anyone in Gambia because we are not at that level yet. So why don't I go to a country that as early as recently as 1990, 1991, 92, it was at 0. But then now they are developed too fast. They are actually developing too fast. So we want to go and learn how they are doing it. So that student decided to come to Rwanda. I hope he's in the same university that has organized this workshop. And one of the things that he should learn is actually being part of this workshop to see how traditional knowledge can be recognized, respected, and revitalized, and also used as a reconciliation tool. Thank you so much. I'll be available for any questions you might have. Thank you.